The 117th Boston Marathon was happening on Patriots Day, April 15, 2013. Everything was set for another great race until disaster struck. At 2:49 p.m., two bombs were detonated roughly 210 yards, or 190 meters apart at the marathon's finish line on Boylston Street, near Copley Square. The frontrunners had long since crossed the finish, but with over 5,700 runners still closing in on the finishing line, the injuries were great. 3 people lost their lives that day, 17 people lost limbs, and hundreds were injured. But who was responsible for this attack, and what was their motive for inflicting this pain and suffering? This is the story of what happened. The blasts were so severe that the windows on the nearby buildings were blown out. Thankfully, there was no structural damage. Medical workers and rescue personnel who had been on hand for the marathon were quick to give aid to those affected by the blast. Ambulances drove in from neighboring cities, and additional police and firefighters were dispatched to the scene. 3 civilians were killed and roughly 265 others were treated at 27 local hospitals. 17 people required amputations, some even suffering amputations from the blast itself. Police followed the standard emergency plan and diverted the remaining runners to Boston Common and Kenmore Square. Surrounding hotels and buildings were evacuated for fears of another blast. As soon as all injured people were transported from the scene, police blocked off a 15-block area around the explosion site. The next day, this was changed to a 12-block crime scene. There were many bags and packages that had been abandoned by people who ran from the explosions, which meant police were unsure about possible other bombs yet to be detonated. Airspace over Boston was restricted, and all departures from Boston Logan International Airport were put on hold. Then it was on to the investigation. The FBI headed the investigation with assistance from other agencies like the CIA, the National Counterterrorism Center, and the Drug Enforcement Administration. Initial theories pointed to North Korea being responsible for the attack since there had been recent escalating tensions between them and the U.S., but government officials said there had been no intelligence reports that suggested anything. A House Intelligence Committee member, Peter King, said, "I received 2 top-secret briefings last week on the current threat levels in the United States, and there was no evidence of this at all." Combing the area was a massive undertaking in search for all available evidence. This included nails, pieces of metal, ball bearings, black nylon pieces from a backpack, remains from an electronic circuit board, and wiring. The lid of a pressure cooker was found on a rooftop near where the explosion had gone off. Investigators were able to confirm that both detonation devices had been pressure cooker bombs that were manufactured by the bombers. Jeff Bowman was right next to one of the bombs and lost both of his legs in the blast. While in hospital, he wrote, "Bag, saw the guy, looked right at me." When he was well enough to, Jeff gave a detailed description of the suspects, which led to CCTV images of them being identified. At 5:20 p.m. on April 18th, the FBI released security camera footage of the 2 suspects carrying backpacks and asked for the public's help in identifying them. Some people had already been wrongly identified by news reports and on social media, also released the images in an effort to limit harm to those identified incorrectly. The security camera footage showed the suspects sticking around after the bombs went off, watching the chaos ensue before strolling away. At roughly 7:40 p.m., only hours after the photos were released, Sean Collier of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Police Department was shot 6 times after the suspects ambushed him in an effort to steal his sidearm, which they were unable to free from his holster due to the security retention system. Sean Collier died soon after, adding another casualty to the list. The suspects then went on to carjack a Mercedes-Benz M-Class SUV in the Allston-Brighton neighborhood of Boston. Chinese national Dun Danny Ming, the owner of the vehicle, was taken hostage by one of the men, while the other followed in their green Honda Civic. The 2 forced Dun Ming to withdraw $800 from his bank account. Next, the suspects drove to a Shell gas station to fill up. They would need a full tank for their next target, Times Square. While one of them was inside buying food, Dun Ming jumped from the vehicle and ran across the street to a mobile gas station and asked the clerk to quickly call 911. Dun's cell phone was still in his Mercedes, which meant police were able to follow its location and focus their search in Watertown. Minutes after midnight on April 19th, Joseph Reynolds, a Watertown police officer, identified the suspects in the Honda and stolen Mercedes. Joseph followed the vehicles while waiting for additional officers to do a high-risk traffic stop when both the vehicles stopped at the intersection of Laurel and Dexter. The suspect in the Mercedes immediately got out of the car and opened fire on Joseph Reynolds and Sergeant John McClellan. The officers returned fire and requested urgent assistance via the radios. The shooting didn't stop after additional officers arrived, and the ordeal lasted nearly 7 minutes. It was estimated that 200 to 300 rounds of ammunition was fired in the altercation. 56 had come from the suspect with other items thrown, such as at least one pressure cooker bomb and a few handmade grenades. The Watertown Police Department, Cambridge Police Department, Boston Police Department, Massachusetts State Police, and the MBTA Transit Police Department were all involved in the shootout, with the majority of officers having either a Glock 22 or a Glock 23.40 S&W caliber pistols. One of the suspects eventually ran out of ammunition and threw his empty pistol at Watertown PD Sergeant Jeffrey Pugliese, who went on to tackle the suspect with Sergeant McClellan's help. The other suspect then drove the Mercedes towards the other suspect and the police. Officers attempted to drag the man from the car's direct path and handcuff him, but they were unsuccessful and he was run over by the car and dragged a short distance down the street. Sergeant McClellan believed the suspect in the car thought the officers were doing CPR on another officer and had attempted to run them over, not realizing it was his partner on the ground. The suspect abandoned the car after about a half mile and fled on foot. The wounded man was taken into custody and received medical care at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. He had been severely injured after being hit by the car and succumbed to his injuries at 1:35 a.m. A Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority police officer, Richard H. Donahue Jr., was critically injured after being shot in the leg while other officers were shooting at the fleeing suspect. Luckily, he survived. Tragically, Boston Police Department officer Dennis Simmons wasn't so lucky. He had been wounded by a hand grenade and died as a result of his injury on April 10, 2014, almost a year after the bombing. 15 other officers were injured during the shootout. Finally, authorities were able to confirm the names of the suspects thanks to the Honda's records. The men responsible for the Boston Marathon bombing were brothers Dzhokhar Jahar Tsarnaev and Temerian Tsarnaev. Their family had moved to the United States in 2002 seeking political asylum. Tamerlan was 26 years old at the time of the bombing, and his brother, Dzhokhar, was only 19 years old. Tamerlan was born in 1986 in the Kalmyk Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, North Caucasus. Dzhokhar was born in 1993 in Kyrgyzstan, but some reports say that his family claimed he was born in Dagestan. The family nor the boys ever lived in Chechnya, but the brother identified themselves as Chechen. When the Tsarnaev family moved to the U.S., they settled in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Tamerlan went to Bunker Hill Community College, but he dropped out to pursue a career as a boxer. His aim was to get a place on the U.S. Olympic boxing team. On July 15, 2010, Tamerlan married Catherine Russell in the Masjid Al-Quran Mosque. He had a history of violence before the bombing, which included an arrest in 2009 for assaulting his girlfriend. It is unclear if this was the woman he later married. The brothers were Muslim by faith, but family of Tamerlan say he became more devout after 2009. The FBI was actually informed by the Russian Federal Security Service, or FSB, in 2011 that Tamerlan was a follower of radical Islam. The FBI didn't just overlook this, they interviewed Tamerlan and his family as well as performed database searches, but they were unable to find evidence of terrorism activity, domestic or foreign. Tamerlan traveled to Dagestan in 2012 and was reportedly visiting a mosque on Kontrova Street in Machkala, which the FSB believed to be linked with radical Islam. Tamerlan was also connected to a triple homicide in Waltham, Massachusetts, that took place on the evenings of September 11, 2011. At the time, however, he was not suspect in the case. Brendan Mess, Eric Weissman, and Raphael Tekin were all murdered in Brendan's apartment. The attack was brutal, and all three had their throats slit from ear to ear, so badly they were nearly decapitated. Authorities believed that the killer and the victims had to know each other. Tamerlan happened to have previously described Brendan Mess as his best friend. After the bombing occurred and the information that came out from his personal life, Tamerlan was looked at as a strong suspect in the case. Various reputable news sources have reported on strong evidence that ties Tamerlan to the murders. In 2013, Dzhokhar was a student at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth, and was majoring in marine biology. Tamerlan's boxing coach told NBC that Dzhokhar deeply admired Tamerlan and looked up to him. Some reports say that the boy's mother, Zubadet Tsarnaev, is a radical extremist and jihad supporter whose belief influenced their son's actions. Tamerlan and his mother had actually been on a terrorism watch list for roughly 18 months before the bombing took place. In the early morning hours of April 19th, Watertown and Somerville residents were sent an automated call requesting that they all remain indoors. Governor Patrick also asked Watertown residents, as well as residents in neighboring towns and cities, to shelter in place. The 20-block area around Watertown was blocked off and residents were warned to not leave their homes. Officers got to work trying to locate Dzhokhar. Helicopters flew over the area and officers went door to door. Heavily armored SWAT team vehicles also drove through in a formation. All public transport was suspended and Logan International Airport was open, but under high security. Some officers went to the brothers' Cambridge home, where 7 homemade explosive devices were found. The April 19th search had gone without leads until a call came in from Watertown resident David Hannabury. It had been 2 hours since the shelter-in-place order had been lifted when David noticed that the tarp on his parked boat seemed loose. He went to check it out, and that is when he discovered a body lying in the boat and a pool of blood. Authorities came and surrounded the boat, and a helicopter verified movement using a thermal imaging device. The person inside started to poke at the tarp, and in response, police opened fire. Boston Police Commissioner Ed Davis and Watertown Police Chief DeVoe both said Dzhokhar was shooting at authorities from inside the boat. But when he was finally captured, the suspect had no weapon on his person. Dzhokhar Tserniev was arrested at 8:42 p.m. He was in critical condition, having suffered gunshots to the head, neck, legs, and hand. He was taken straight to Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, the same hospital his brother had been taken to. When initial reports came out, they blamed the neck wound on a suicide attempt, but this was obviously contradicted by the fact that he was unarmed. A review by the Commonwealth Massachusetts had the following to say regarding the events. One officer fired his weapon without appropriate authority in response to perceived movement in the boat, and surrounding officers followed suit in a round of contagious fire. Assuming they were being fired on by the suspect, weapons continued to be fired for several seconds until on-scene supervisors ordered a ceasefire and regained control of the scene. The unauthorized shots created another dangerous crossfire situation. The chaos was caused mainly by the lack of a coordinated law enforcement effort, as thousands of officers had self-deployed into the Watertown area during the events. Dzhokhar survived his injuries and was questioned by investigators for 16 hours before he stopped communication with them on the night of April 22nd. This came after Judge Marion Bowler read him the Miranda warning. Federal law enforcement officials had not given Dzhokhar a Miranda warning as they invoked the warning's public safety exception. April 22, 2013 also saw formal criminal charges being brought against Dzhokhar in the United States District Court for the District of Massachusetts. A bedside hearing was performed while he was in hospital. He was charged with the use of a weapon of mass destruction with malicious destruction of property resulting in death, along with a host of other charges. These charges can carry sentences of life imprisonment or even the death penalty. During his hearing, Dzhokhar had deemed to be lucid and mentally competent. He responded to questions by nodding or shaking his head. When the judge asked him if he was able to afford his attorney, he responded no. This meant he was represented by the Federal Public Defender's Office. 7 days after he was arrested on April 26, 2013, Dzhokhar was moved from the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center to the Federal Medical Center in Fort Devens. FMC Devens is a federal prison medical facility. Dzhokhar was kept in solitary confinement in a segregated housing unit that has a 23-hour-per-day lockdown. On July 10, 2013, Dzhokhar pleaded not guilty to 30 charges during his first public court appearance. This included the murder of MIT police officer Sean Collier's murder. On September 23rd, he was back in court for a status hearing. Here, his lawyer asked for more time to prepare their defense. United States Senators Kelly Ayotte, John McCain, Saxby Chambliss, Lindsey Graham, and Representative Peter T. King all suggested that Dzhokhar should be tried as an unlawful enemy combatant instead of a criminal. This would potentially mean Dzhokhar would be unable to receive legal counsel, but others stepped forward and said that would be illegal and actually jeopardize the prosecution's case. The U.S. government made the decision to try Dzhokhar in the federal criminal court system, but didn't try him as an enemy combatant. Jury selection began on the 5th of January 2015 and was finalized on the 3rd of March. The jury consisted of 8 men and 10 women with 6 alternates. The trial officially started on March 4th. Assistant U.S. Attorney William Winreb described Dzhokhar and the bombing as a soldier in a holy war against Americans, whose motive was reaching paradise. He said the brothers were equal participants. Dzhokhar's defense attorney, Judy Clark, admitted that he had placed the second bomb and was present when Sean Collier was murdered. Dunming was hijacked and at the Watertown shootout, but she stressed the influence his older brother had on him. She was trying to paint him as a follower. From the 4th of March to the 30th of March, the prosecution called over 90 witnesses. These witnesses included victims who had lost limbs in the attack. The government rested their case on March 30th. The defense rested on March 31st. They had called 4 witnesses. On April 8, 2014, Dzhokhar Tserniev was found guilty on all 30 counts. April 21st marked the start of the sentencing phase. A verdict was reached on May 15th. It recommended that Dzhokhar be put to death for his crimes. On June 24th, he apologized to his victims before being sentenced to death. 4 years after this sentencing, Djokar's lawyers appealed the verdict. The appeal was based on the groups that the court's refusal to allow the trial to take place in another city deprived Dzhokhar of a fair trial. On July 30th, 2020, Djokar's death sentence was reversed by the United States Court of Appeals. It found the jurors had not been properly screened on how much they knew of the case. His death sentence and 3 other convictions were overturned. A new penalty phase trial was ordered with a new jury. Regardless of this outcome, Djokar's remaining convictions still ensured he would spend the rest of his life in prison. The U.S. government appealed this ruling to the U.S. Supreme Court in March 2021. They were granted certiorari in the United States versus Arnav case. This was argued before the Supreme Court on October 13, 2021. FBI interrogators said that Dzhokhar and Tamerlan were motivated by Islamic beliefs. However, they were not connected to any known terrorist groups. The brothers had learned how to build explosive weapons from an online Al-Qaeda magazine. They went on to say that Dzhokhar and his brother considered suicide attacks and striking the Boston Pops fireworks spectacular on the 4th of July. But they decided against the plan and went with remote-activated pressure cooker bombs and other IEDs. Dzhokhar's reason for the bombing was that he and Tamerlan wanted to defend Islam from the United States. He accepted the U.S. of being responsible for the Iraq War and war in Afghanistan against Muslims. CBS reported that Djokhar had scribbled a note onto the inside of the boat he was lying in. The note said that the bombings were retribution for U.S. military action in Afghanistan and Iraq. He went on to call the victims of the attack collateral damage, in the same way innocent victims have been called collateral damage in the U.S. wars around the world. 3 people died that day as a direct result of the bombings. 29-year-old Crystal Marie Campbell, who was a restaurant manager from Medford, Massachusetts. She was killed by the first bomb. The following 2 victims were 23-year-old Lu Lingji, a Chinese national and Boston University graduate, and 8-year-old Martin William Richard from Dorchester, Boston. They were both killed by the second bomb. Jean A. Collier and Dennis Simmons took the death toll from the bombing and resulting hunt for the suspects to 5 innocent victims. Countless others had their lives changed forever that day. Mayor Marty Walsh declared April 15th an official holiday on the 2nd anniversary of the bombing. It was named One Boston Day, dedicated to doing random acts of kindness and helping others. The Boston Marathon bombing inspired 2 movies, Patriots Day, which was released in December 2016, and Stronger, which followed the story of Jeff Bauman, the man who had lost both of his legs in the attack. His movie was released in September of 2017.